So here I am now broadcasting live, and I'm going to deliver to you those notes on Thank You Ma'am in a more clear way because the class ones were kind of sketchy. So anyway, let's go through the entire story. Make sure you jot down these notes as we go. Anything that I talk about is important and will likely be highlighted on your test. So as we start Thank You Ma'am, we begin with characterization of Mrs. Jones. Okay, she was a large woman with a large purse that had everything in it but a hammer and nails. It had a long strap and she carried it slung across her shoulder. So again, we get some characterization about Mrs. Jones here. She's a large woman. She's carrying a purse that has everything in it, which says everything but a bag of hammers and nails. Now, not literally does she have everything in the world but a hammer and nails in her purse. That expression is meant to tell us that there is a lot of stuff in her purse, okay? We kind of get the impression that Mrs. Jones is the type of woman that you do not want to mess with. Jason used the example of Medea in class, and that's actually a really good example. That's exactly what I picture when I read about Mrs. Jones. So we start off with some characterization, and that's really one of the biggest parts of Thank You Ma'am is the characterization. Us getting to know Mrs. Jones, us getting to know Roger, understanding Roger's motivation for taking the action of stealing Mrs. Jones's purse, okay? We also get clues about setting. It was about 11 o'clock at night, dark, and she was walking alone when a boy ran up behind her and tried to snatch her purse. Now, we talked in class about how this is probably taking place like in a big city like New York or maybe Chicago possibly. Langston Hughes, who is the author, was a big part of the Harlem Renaissance and actually was from New York or lived for a long period of time in New York City. So we do get the impression this is probably New York City that he's talking about here. And it's 11 o'clock at night, totally dark. This woman is walking home, and this young boy comes and snatches her purse. Now, you know, at 11 o'clock at night, we have to assume if this boy is out, he probably does not have a lot of parental support at home. Nobody to tell him, you don't leave the house at 11 o'clock, you don't go out after dark, especially in a big city like New York. Okay, so again, gives us clues about characterization of Roger, but also delivers some information to us about the setting. Roger then tries to steal Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones's purse. And we talked about how she reacted to Roger by basically grabbing him by the shirt, okay, and kicking him in the butt. This we talked about would not likely happen today, all right? If you're mugged in the city, in New York City especially, I'm hoping that you're just going to be like, take whatever you want, okay, and hopefully just go out of that situation being unharmed. But this woman does not react in the way that we expect that she is going to, all right? Because Roger is just a young boy, it describes him as being fragile. She does. She just grabs him by the shirt, okay, and kind of shakes him. So her motivation here is likely to teach Roger a lesson, all right? To teach him that this is not an acceptable thing to do. So she grabs Roger. We know that she ends up taking him home to her own apartment. Again, we talked about how that would just not happen today because children's services would be called, the police would get involved, Mrs. Jones would be, probably taken up on kidnapping charges or something. But again, this is taking place during a different time period. This is likely late 50s, early 60s. You can talk to your parents or your grandparents about how that was a different time and how we always think about the past as being safer, less violence, less kids doing drugs, people had more morals, everybody was a hard worker, everything was made in America. We talk about those qualities as things that, we kind of reminisce about and we like about our past. And the trend is that as things progress into the future, maybe things, people become more open-minded, but typically we discuss decline, okay? So when we talk about, Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones taking Roger home to teach him a lesson, this is something that we discussed that would likely not happen today, okay? Also, one important thing to note is Mrs. Jones's dialect, okay? Gives us clues about, who she is as a person, gives us clues about what area she is coming from. An example of dialect from the story would be when she says to the boy, "What did you want to do it for?" And then he says, "I didn't aim to," and she says, "You a lie," okay? Like, you're lying, you obviously were intending to take my purse. You saying you didn't mean to, okay? But again, that's an example of dialect, okay? Just like if we were to go to the South, you know, they would use a Southern dialect, okay? What we would call like a Southern drawl, but gives us clues about where the story is taking place and also gives us, you know, more information about her as a character. So dialect is important. Roger almost immediately apologizes when he tries to take her purse. Mrs. Jones responds by saying, your face is dirty, okay? So that's not meant to like call him out on that. She's just making observations about Roger as a person, all right? And we talked about characters and character interactions and how we learn about characters in the same way that we learn about real people. So she's just looking at Roger's appearance and making some judgments about him based on those factors, okay? The fact that his face is dirty isn't really significant. What she's actually observing about him is that, you know, he likely does not have anybody at home to tell him to wash his face, okay? Which is, again, probably why he has made the decision to steal her purse, okay? So we're just learning about characters, again, in the same way that you and I would learn about real people. So then that's where she makes the decision to take Roger home. She says, ain't you got nobody at home to tell you to wash your face? He says, no. And then she says, then it will get washed this evening, said the large woman starting up the street, dragging the frightened boy behind her. So she actually then makes the decision to take Roger into her own home. He looked as if he were 14 or 15, so more information about character there. Frail and willow wild in tennis shoes and blue jeans, okay? And we talked about the connotation of the word frail, okay? We talked about that, about how that gives us information about who Roger is as a character, the fact that he's probably not getting 3 square meals a day because he doesn't have parents at home to deliver those to him. So very good word choice by Langston Hughes there, choosing the word frail to give us more understanding of Roger as a character. Then she says, you ought to be my son. I would teach you right from wrong. Least I can do right now is to wash your face. Are you hungry? And we think that as Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones is asking that question, she probably knows the answer, okay? She knows that if this boy is making these decisions, if he looks like he's not very clean, there's nobody at home. So she knows that he's probably home, has already made the decision to take Roger home with her and feed him, wash his face, and just to show him what a motherly, grandmotherly, like, caring person would do for him. No, said the being dragged boy, I just want you to turn me loose. And then Mrs. Jones says, was I bothering you when I turned that corner? Asked the woman. No. But you put yourself in contact with me, said the woman. If you think that contact is not going to last a while, you've got another thought coming. When I get through with you, sir, you are going to remember Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones. So again, that gives us more information about the kind of person that Mrs. Jones is. Okay, when she addresses Roger, we have to assume that, you know, now she has made the decision that she's going to make an impact on this young boy's life. She is taking him back to her own apartment. She is going to feed him dinner. I'll meet you in Mr. Walters' room. Okay, sorry. It says, sweat popped out on the boy's face, and he began to struggle. Mrs. Jones stopped, jerked him around in front of her, put a half Nelson around his neck, and continued to drag him up the street. So we know that Mrs. Jones is kind of a force to be reckoned with at this point. She is not going to let this boy get away. She is bound and determined to teach Roger a lesson. So that would be her motivation. When she got to her door, she dragged the boy inside, down a hall, and into a large kitchenette-furnished room at the rear of the house. She switched on the light and left the door open. The boy could hear the other roomers laughing and talking in the large house. Some of their doors were open too, so he knew that he and the woman were not alone. The woman still had him by the neck in the middle of her room. She said, "What is your name?" "Roger," answered the boy. "Then, Roger, you go to that sink and wash your face," said the woman, whereupon she turned him loose at last. And Roger looked to the door, looked at the woman, looked at the door, and then went to the sink. Okay? So that shows us that Roger is trying to determine in this moment whether or not he should just make a bolt for it and dash out of the house, or if he should stay and actually humor this woman, let her teach him a lesson, become a better person for this. So he actually decides then to stay. He makes the decision to stay. We get more clues here too about the setting. Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones is likely not a very wealthy woman. She's living in a house with a lot of other people. They must have a pretty safe, I don't know, maybe open community where she's living, because she makes the point to leave her door open. Maybe she does that so that Roger feels more safe, or maybe she just does that on a regular basis, just as part of the sense of community that they have in this house. The woman still had him by the neck in the middle of her room. She asks his name, and then she makes the point of telling him, "Let the water run until it gets warm." She said, "Here's a clean towel." Why would Mrs. Jones make the point of telling Roger to let the water run until it's warm, unless she really didn't just, she cares for him and she wants to show him that. So he hands him a clean towel so that he can wash his face. Again, that shows the caring nature of Mrs. Jones. And then he asks her point blank, "You going to take me to jail?" asks the boy, bending over the sink. And she says, "Not with that face. I would not take you nowhere," said the woman. "Here I am trying to get home to cook me a bite to eat, and you snatch my pocketbook. Maybe you ain't been to your supper either, late as it be, have you?" So again, she's asking a question that she likely knows the answer to. She knows that Roger has probably not eaten and is actually going to fix him a meal right here, past 11 o'clock at night. So as we go into the next part, Roger admits, "There's nobody home at my house," said the boy. So we get confirmation there that Roger is, nobody at home is taking care of Roger, and this is a sad situation. And Mrs. Jones is actually kind of looking at Roger and his parents in the same way that maybe your grandparents look at our current time period. There are, it's kind of almost a flaw in the society. She's looking at this boy who's not being taken care of, and she says things like, "You ought to be my son. I would teach you right from wrong." So again, she is trying to teach him a lesson. She says, "Then we'll eat," said the woman. "I believe you're hungry or been hungry to try and snatch my pocketbook." And then Roger finally delivers the reason why he tried to snatch her pocketbook. He says, "I want a pair of blue suede shoes," okay? Which is kind of an allusion to an Elvis song, which would have been popular around this time period. Just like you guys probably want things from maybe like basketball players, their shoes or whatever. Elvis sang a song about blue suede shoes. Would have been a popular thing during this time period, and that is probably why Roger wants the blue suede shoes. But Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones' response is really interesting to us, because we don't expect anybody really to offer such kindness when a person has done something wrong, okay, has actually tried to steal something from you. But she says, "Well, you don't have to snatch my pocketbook to get some suede shoes," said Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones. "You could have asked me," okay? And we said that's just so strange, because we don't expect people to treat us with kindness when we have, committed a wrong against that person. So again, just shows, the way that Mrs. Jones is trying to teach Roger a lesson. The water dripping from his face, the boy looked at her, and there was a long pause, a very long pause. After he dried his face, and not knowing what else to do, he dried it again, and the boy turned around, wondering what next. The door was open. He could make a dash for it down the hall. He could run, 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 run. So here we have Roger, almost confused about why this woman is being so kind to him when he has, committed an act, of stealing against her. So he's almost kind of feeling awkward at this point. Like, what do I do? Like, what is this woman all about? I tried to steal from her, and here she is, fixing me dinner and telling me that she would have just given me money for shoes that I wanted. So again, we don't expect people to act that way, but this is just the kind of person that Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones is. So the woman was sitting on the daybed, and after a while she said, "I were young once, and I wanted things I could not get." And then there was another long pause, and the boy's mouth opened. Then he frowned, not knowing that he had frowned. And the woman said, "You thought I was going to say, 'but,' didn't you? You thought I was going to say, 'But I didn't snatch people's pocketbooks.' Well, I wasn't going to say that," okay? And then there was a pause and some silence. "I have done things too, which I would not tell you, son, neither tell God if he didn't already know. Everybody's got something in common. So you sit down while I fix us something to eat. You might run that comb through your hair so you will look presentable." So here, Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones makes the confession that she has made mistakes too in her life, okay? But, here she is, she's got a job, she's earning a living for herself, but also making the point of taking care of kids, and obviously I hope this doesn't happen all the time to her, but, doing some kindness for somebody who doesn't necessarily deserve it, okay? But seeing the value in this young boy and the value of teaching him a lesson. In another corner of the room behind a screen was a gas plate. So Mrs. Jones is just describing the setting, describing the apartment where she lives. Seems to be a small place. She is sitting on she's fixing dinner for him in the kitchen. The bed is basically in the same room, so just a very small one-room apartment. So she's not a wealthy woman, but again, she's willing to be kind to Roger and to teach him a lesson. So then he makes a point of sitting within her line of sight so that she understands that he is not going to make the point of stealing her pocketbook, which is actually still on the bed as well. He actually makes the comment to her, asks her the question, "Do you need somebody to go to the store?" asks the boy. "Maybe go get some milk or something?" And Roger is not asking this because he wants Mrs. Jones to give her money and then take off with it, okay? He understands at this point now that this woman has been extremely kind to him, is trying to teach him a lesson. So he asks that out of, returning kindness. Is there anything I can do for you? You've shown me such kindness. I would really like to do, a favor for you because you've been so kind to me. Mrs. Jones says, "No, I don't believe I do. I was just going to make some cocoa." And he says, "That's fine." So she continues to, just treat Roger with respect, treat him very kindly, make him dinner. She heats up some lima beans and ham for dinner, makes the cocoa, and then she and Roger just sit like a parent would sit with, their child, eating dinner, having conversation. It says she doesn't make a point of asking him any questions about his parents because she knows what the answers will be, and she doesn't want to embarrass Roger. So she tells him about the beauty shop where she works and how it stays open late, and then she offers him half of her 10-cent cake, which would be kind of like one of those Hostess cupcakes or something like that we would eat today. When they were finished eating, she got up and said, "Now here, take this $10 and buy yourself some blue suede shoes. And next time, do not make the mistake of latching onto my pocketbook nor nobody else's, because shoes got by devilish ways will burn your feet." Okay? So again, she is showing Roger this kindness by giving him money to get something that he wants. He's probably never had, $10 to spend on shoes like this before, so this is a really special moment for Roger. And then Roger is almost so overcome by her kindness that he doesn't even know what to say. So he says, "Thank you, ma'am," which is, obviously important because that's the title of our story. And she leads him out of the apartment, watches him go down the steps, and then shuts the door. Okay? So when we talk about characterization, it's really important to note that Roger is a dynamic character. When he starts off in the story, he is, basically kind of like a juvenile delinquent. He is trying to rob Mrs. Jones so that he can get these shoes that he wants. So by taking her pocketbook, he hopes to be able to do that. But by the end of the story, he really understands what Mrs. Jones is trying to do for him. And he actually learns the lesson, I think, that Mrs. Jones is trying to teach him. So when we talk about characterization, we talk about Roger as being a dynamic character because he has a change of heart during the story. Okay? Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones doesn't really fit that bill. She doesn't really change throughout the course of the story. She's a good person at the beginning, and she's a pretty good person by the end. She's really kind to Roger, and she doesn't have to be. And most people wouldn't expect her to be in that situation. So she's actually not really what we would consider a dynamic character, although she is a very important character in the story, one of two, and that's it. And when we talk about characterization, we also talk about round and flat characters. We have a lot of information about Roger and Mrs. Jones because there are only two characters, so both of them would be considered round, okay? Also, when we talk about characterization, we talk about protagonists and antagonists and who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. Now, at the beginning of Thank You, Ma'am, we kind of are presented with Roger, who seems like an antagonist because he's doing this bad thing, and Mrs. Jones seems like the good guy in this situation. So she would be our protagonist, he would be our antagonist. But really, English is hard because authors don't always make, these characters that fit the bill of being a protagonist or an antagonist, right? So Roger does this bad thing, but he's really not antagonistic throughout the story. He's dynamic, so he makes that change, and by the end, we really can't consider Roger an antagonist anymore because, you know, he has learned from Mrs. Jones and hopefully in the future is going to make better decisions. So I hate to tell you, but sometimes English is hard and it just doesn't, you know, follow these really clean-cut patterns. And as far as the protagonist goes, like I said, Mrs. Llewellyn Bates Washington Jones is obviously a good person, but without, you know, an antagonist, I'm not so sure that we have like a protagonist either. So not really clean-cut roles there. And again, we only have 2 characters, so this short story is kind of different in that way. And I think that's all. We talked about foreshadowing in class today, and we got some clarification on that. But again, short stories don't always have, you know, those exact literary terms applied. So we said there's not really a good example of foreshadowing in this story. There's tons and tons and tons of characterization, okay? So by the end of Thank You, Ma'am, you should really feel like you know who Mrs. Jones is, and you know who Roger is, and you see that change in him, and you understand how he changes, and you understand Mrs. Jones's motivation for helping him change, okay? So characterization is really the most important part of this story. If you have any questions, you know where I am.